Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about a book from Lebanon. When searching for a book from Lebanon, I came across a novel written by a Lebanese French author about a Persian poet who I love and I couldn't pass this chance to read it. Omar Khayyam is a very famous poet in Persian language, but also around the world. His poem centers on the idea that life is short, so try to enjoy it while it lasts. This went against the religious piety which was the norm in 11th century Persia. Lebanon is very diverse, with 18 religions. It was colonized by the French, so Beirut was called the Paris of Middle East. Lebanese people apparently smoke a lot, a habit they have learned from the French, most likely. Lebanon is the only Middle Eastern country with no desert. The famous quote by John F. Kennedy, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," was a quote from a Lebanese poet who's also the third best-selling poet in the entire world, after Shakespeare and Lao Tzu. Cedar is the tree in their flag as a symbol of longevity. Talking of longevity, the name Lebanon is 4,000 years old. Not only Lebanon has the oldest name, it is also the smallest country in Asia. In order to keep this title, Lebanon should do everything to stop Palestine from being recognized. If Palestine becomes a sovereign state, Lebanon will be the second smallest country in Asia. A country of about 7 million people. Okay, let me tell you about the author. Amin Maalouf was born in 1949 in Lebanon and moved to France in 1976 and has lived there ever since. He mostly fictionalizes the life of famous people. His other novels include Leo Africanus, about that very person. He has written about Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, an old religion from Persia. And this novel is about Omar Khayyam, the Persian poet, astronomer, philosopher, and mathematician. Okay, now let me summarize the novel for you. The novel is about a manuscript of poetry by Omar Khayyam written 1,000 years ago. It follows the manuscript and talks about the politics and history of the region along the way. The narrator is American, Benjamin Lesage, or Benjamin Lesage, tells the story of one particular manuscript of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, which was lost in the Titanic incident in 1912. The novel is divided into 4 books, like Khayyam's poetry in the form of Rubaiyat. Incidentally, Rubaiyat means 4 in Arabic. Despite its Arabic name, it's purely a Persian form of poetry. It's a form that was more popular among the ordinary people. It's like haiku in the Japanese literature. Very easy to memorize and very easy to recite. So, back to the novel. Book 1 takes us to 11th century Persia, to the city of Samarkand, the modern-day Uzbekistan, where we meet a young poet by the name of Omar Khayyam. He's from the Persian town of Nishapur, who was recently moved to Samarkand, the city of dreams in those days. He's famed for writing poems about wine and pleasures of this life. So when we meet him for the first time, he's actually confronted by a mob and finally rescued by a judge who appreciates his talent. Instead of punishing him, the judge gives him a blank book on which Khayyam would write his 4-line poems, or rubai. In this part of the novel, we have our first love interest between Khayyam and a court lady called Jahan. In book 2, Omar then moves to Isfahan, the capital of Seljuk Mamluk Shah, and builds an observatory to study astronomy. Here, he meets 2 other important characters in Iranian history: Nizam al-Mulk, the brilliant vizier and statesman, and Hassan Sabah, the brilliant leader of the assassins. Omar witnesses Nizam al-Mulk and Hassan Sabah go head-to-head, and Nizam al-Mulk sabotages Hassan and he is banished from the city. Sabah belonged to the Shia Ismaili branch of Islam, and Nizam was a Sunni Muslim who worked for the Turkish Seljuks. Hassan Sabah, after establishing the order of assassins, manages to assassinate Nizam and set up his base on Mount Alamut in the north of Iran. Things go pear-shaped in Isfahan, so Omar flees back to Samarkand. By then, he's a very old man. He has to return to his hometown of Nishapur. But his book of poems, or Rubaiyat, arrives at Mount Alamut, where the assassins keep it for the next 150 years or so. When the Mongols sack Alamut a century or so later, the book ends up in the Iranian city of Kerman. Book 3 of the novel takes us to 1890s, and our narrator Benjamin tells his own story of learning about Khayyam, and then he meets another character, Jamaluddin, an intellectual who's exiled in Europe who once had the possession of this book. When he returns to Iran, he ends up losing the book. This part is a lot about politics of Iran, sandwiched between the Russians and the British during the Great Game of 19th century. Benjamin, hearing that the book might be in Iran, decides to visit the country. Jamaluddin writes him a few recommendation letters, and Benjamin travels to Iran, but when he arrives, he's caught up when Jamaluddin's friend Mr. Kermani assassinates the Qajar king of Iran, and Benjamin is implicated in the plot. But with the help of some women, he escapes to safety and then out of the country. The final part, or book 4, tells us the story of how Benjamin returns to Iran in the turn of the century, and with the help of an Iranian princess, Shirin, finds the book. They fall in love and make their way to America via Turkey and finally on the Titanic. We know what happens next. The book ends up at the bottom of the ocean. Things I liked about this book: reading this novel makes me visit Samarkand. The alleyways, the palaces, the streets are dark. Also, there's a sense of freedom being in that period. Of course, we see things from the lens of a novel where everything is simplified. That's what is enticing about the past. Everything is so much simpler. Anyway, the beginning of the novel is really beautiful. I wish the author had spent more time in Samarkand. There's one particular passage where Omar Khayyam talks about art and science. He argues that science is ever changing while art pretty much stays the same. Our basic human emotions stay the same. It's so true. One of the problems I face when reading novels based on real people is my mind keeps asking questions whether it's true or made up, dashing between fact and fiction. But in this novel, I tried to focus on the novel, whether the story is convincing or not. But the novel too seems conflicted and tries to be more factual than fictional. This makes the third part of the book a bit dull as it loses focus. It ends up telling the political and the tumultuous history of Iran instead. The novel's theme seems to be the survival of a book for 1,000 years is nothing short of a miracle. The fact that we can still read Omar Khayyam's poetry is extraordinary, given the tumultuous history of Iran, with constant invasions and battles, and cities were burned down and cities were destroyed. But we still have Omar Khayyam's poetry, which is amazing. Now, while we're here, let me tell you a little bit about Khayyam. He is one of my favorite poets. Khayyam was born in Nishapur in 1043, only 20 years after the death of Ferdowsi, another giant of Persian literature, which I talked in another video. Ferdowsi and Khayyam were both from the same region of Iran, called Khorasan, a land of the sun in Arabic. I think Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, must have had a huge influence on Omar Khayyam's poetry and his general outlook on life, and must have made him quite a pessimist. I'll explain that later. Khayyam's name means tent maker, perhaps an occupation of his parents. His somewhat humble background is reflected in his poetry that emphasizes that we as humans are nothing special. He was a gifted kid, so he was educated by great teachers of the time. In 1070, he went to Samarkand, where the novel begins. Later, he went to Isfahan to set up an observatory to measure the length of the year to help the Persian calendar, which is a solar calendar, unlike the Islamic calendar, which is lunar. He wrote a few scientific books, but for us, it is his poetry that's most interesting. He died in his hometown at the age of 83 in 1131. He is considered a Sufi poet. What is Sufi? It was a movement in Islamic Iran, mostly among poets, intellectuals, and philosophers. The most famous Sufi poet is, of course, Rumi, who was born in modern-day Afghanistan and spent most of his life in Turkey. That's the name Rumi, or someone from Rome. Sufi simply means people who were wearing woolen cloaks, who believed in the power of love and always talked about wine. But wine is only symbolic, and love is the love of God. And dervish simply means poor. So these were the people who had abandoned the worldly pleasures, so to speak, and devoted their lives to meditation, poetry, and God. But Omar Khayyam's poetry is a bit more different. It is more materialistic. Khayyam's subjects are usually wine, earthly pleasures, criticism of religious people. But the main subject seems to be the meaninglessness of life and how it's fleeting. The most important symbolism is clay. Humans are not special. We're just a pile of clay. We come from earth, we end up there. That's all there is to it. So you might as well enjoy your life here and now. It's very zen if you think about it. In a lot of his poems, he rejects the afterlife and the promise of heaven or hell. I think he was a man of science, so he understood the mechanics of nature pretty well, and it was through poetry that he was expressing his true feelings about things. According to Sadiq Hidayat, an Iranian intellectual and novelist whose novel The Blind Owl I discussed in another video, Khayyam was an atheist, or at least he didn't believe in soul being separate from the body, and was very much against the religious view of life. When he talks about wine as antidote to existential suffering, it's very similar to the Buddhist idea that life is nothing but suffering. Christopher Hitchens quoted Khayyam in his book, The Portable Atheist. Whether he was an atheist or not, he really captured the imagination of the Victorian English people in 1870s when his Rubaiyat was translated by Edward Fitzgerald. This was a tough time in England among the intellectual elites, as Darwin had published his theory of evolution by natural selection, so God was questioned and the man was nothing but animals. Omar Khayyam's poems captured the mood of the English people as they had to accept their fate that there was no afterlife. They had to enjoy this life while it lasts. I think that's the main message of Khayyam. Life is too short and you only have one chance. Be good and be happy. I think Khayyam is more anti-humanist than atheist. Humanism grew in Europe as a rejection of religious dogma. For humanists, humans are sacred. All humans are equal and almost godly creature that owns the earth and can do anything they want. Own it, divide it, even destroy it. Khayyam says, humans are nothing special. You're just as important as the pot of clay that you step on. Here's an example. Yesterday in the marketplace I saw a potter kicking into shape a piece of clay under. The clay spoke in its misshapen tongue, I was once like you, be tender. According to Mehdi Amin Razavi and Glenn von Bromelen in their brilliant article in the Stanford University Encyclopedia, Khayyam displays two trends. In his philosophical books, he's a devout Muslim, but with a more focus on existential experience rather than divine substance. But through his poetry, he questions the meaning of life and religious view of life. Therefore, he proposes that we should enjoy here and now. In that sense, he is closer to the Buddhist view of existence than that of Islam. In Islam, like Christianity, the promise of heaven is pretty strong, so one has to sacrifice the joys and pleasures of this world. But Khayyam's poetry, the focus is on now. Here's an example. Look not above, there is no answer there. Pray not, for no one listens to your prayer. Near is as near to God as any far, and here is just the same deceit as there. You to the mosque with howling hymn and prayer, I to the temple of the vine repair. The one true God in diverse ways to seek, I find him here, but do you find him there? I sent my soul through the invisible, some letter of that afterlife to spell, and by my soul returned to me and answered, I myself am heaven and hell. The sphere upon which mortals come and go has no end nor beginning that we know, and none there is to tell us in plain truth whence do we come and whither we go. O threats of hells and hopes of paradise, one thing at least is certain, this life flies. One thing is certain and the rest is lies. The flower that once has blown forever dies. So these are some of the examples of poetry of Khayyam, my favorite poet of all time. Okay, now let me explain how Ferdowsi's Shahnameh had a huge impression on Khayyam. Shahnameh is full of dead kings. It is practically a graveyard of all the great and not so great kings. When you read it, it strikes you how fleeting and meaningless life is. All those powerful and almost godly kings are all dead. You realize no matter how important a person you are, you will have the same fate one day. Khayyam's poems are full of examples of how great kings have turned into dust. But I could be completely wrong in this. Perhaps Khayyam never read Shahnameh. If you know something, please leave a comment. Now back to the novel. I really enjoyed the novel, but having said that, it does try to do too many things. Just like this video. For one moment I talk about a novel from Lebanon and the next moment I get distracted and talk about Khayyam's poetry. Halfway the author is sidetracked and ends up talking about history of Islamic civilization, Iran, and 19th century politics and many other things. Khayyam's Rubaiyat is still there, but in the background. However, it's a really great novel. It is short and has some great insights into the lives of the people in Iran and especially Omar Khayyam himself. He was a multi-talented person, a brilliant scientist and a genius poet whose outlook on life seemed very contemporary. When you read his poems, you won't believe they were written 1,000 years ago. Let me know what you think. As usual, please leave a comment down below. Thank you.